The stars above the small town of Willow Creek shimmered like scattered diamonds against the velvet night sky. It was one of those rare evenings when the universe seemed to hold its breath, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jake Thompson, a 28-year-old mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart full of regrets, sat on the porch of his childhood home, nursing a lukewarm beer. The house, a creaky old structure that had seen better days, was the only thing he had left after his parents passed away. He hated coming back here, but life had a funny way of dragging you to places you didn't want to be. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a faint hum, like the sound of a distant engine, but softer, more melodic. He frowned, setting the beer bottle down on the wooden railing. The sound grew louder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He squinted into the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source, but the dense trees surrounding the house made it impossible to see anything beyond the faint glow of the porch light. Probably just a drone, he muttered to himself, though the rational explanation did little to ease the unease settling in his gut. Willow Creek wasn't exactly a hotspot for cutting-edge technology. Most folks here still used flip phones and thought Wi-Fi was a passing fad. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made Jake's skin crawl. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and took a cautious step toward the edge of the porch. The night was still, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, out of nowhere, a blinding light erupted from the trees, illuminating the entire yard in a surreal, bluish glow. Jake shielded his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sudden rush of wind that swept through the yard. The light pulsed, growing brighter and brighter, until it was almost unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving Jake blinking spots from his vision. When his eyes finally adjusted, he saw her. Standing in the middle of the yard was a woman, or at least, something that looked like a woman. She was tall, with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water, and hair that cascaded down her back in waves of silver. Her eyes, a deep, otherworldly blue, seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. She was dressed in a sleek, form-fitting suit that looked like it was made of liquid metal, and she radiated an aura of calm, almost regal authority. Jake's first instinct was to run, to bolt back inside the house and lock the door behind him. But something about her presence held him rooted to the spot. She tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and amusement. "Do you recognize me, human?" she asked, her voice smooth and melodic, like the sound of wind chimes on a breezy day. Jake blinked, his mind racing. No. Should I?" She smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips. "I'm your childhood neighbor. Or at least I was." Jake's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of her words. "What are you talking about? I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've never seen you before." The woman, or whatever she was, stepped closer, her movements graceful and deliberate. "You wouldn't remember me. I wasn't exactly visible back then. But I've been watching you, Jake. Watching and waiting." A chill ran down Jake's spine. "Watching me? For what?" "For this moment," she said simply. "The moment when you would finally be ready." "Ready for what?" Jake demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" She paused, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "My name is Lyra, and I need your help." Jake stared at her, his mind reeling. This had to be some kind of prank, or maybe he'd had one too many beers and was hallucinating. But deep down, he knew this was real. The way the air seemed to hum around her, the way her presence commanded attention, it was all too vivid, too intense to be anything but real. "My help?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "With what?" Lyra's expression grew serious, and for the first time, Jake noticed a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "My people are in danger," she said. "And if we don't act soon, your world will be in danger too." Jake's stomach churned as the weight of her words sank in. "What kind of danger?" Lyra hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "There's a force coming, A force that seeks to destroy everything in its path. My people have been fighting it for centuries, but we're losing. We need allies, Jake. We need you. Jake shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. You've got the wrong guy. I'm just a mechanic. I fix cars, not whatever this is. Lyra stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. You're more than that, Jake. You always have been. You just don't know it yet. Before Jake could respond, a loud crash echoed from the woods, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Lyra's eyes widened, and she grabbed Jake's arm with surprising strength. We need to go. Now. Go where? Jake asked, his voice tinged with panic. What's happening? No time to explain, Lyra said, pulling him toward the trees. Just trust me. Jake wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the urgency in her voice left no room for debate. He stumbled after her, his heart pounding as the sounds from the woods grew louder. Whatever was coming, it wasn't friendly. As they disappeared into the darkness, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. And not necessarily for the better. The forest was a blur of shadows and faint moonlight as Jake stumbled after Lyra, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds behind them, heavy footsteps, snapping branches, and a low, guttural growl, were getting closer. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. 1 minute he'd been sitting on his porch, nursing a beer and wallowing in self-pity, and the next, he was running for his life with an alien who claimed to be his childhood neighbor. Lyra! Jake hissed, struggling to keep up. What the hell is chasing us? No time to explain, Lyra replied, her voice calm but urgent. She moved through the trees with an almost supernatural grace, her silver hair catching the faint light like a beacon. Just keep moving. Jake wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how out of his depth he was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lyra came to a sudden stop. Jake nearly collided with her, his legs trembling from the exertion. They were standing in a small clearing, the trees forming a natural barrier around them. In the center of the clearing was a strange, metallic structure that looked like a cross between a spaceship and a futuristic car. It was sleek and angular, with a surface that seemed to shimmer and shift as if alive. What is that? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. All right, Lyra said, stepping toward the structure. She placed her hand on its surface, and a door slid open with a soft hiss. Get in. Jake hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run. But the sounds behind them were growing louder, and he knew he didn't have a choice. He climbed into the vehicle, his eyes widening as he took in the interior. The walls were lined with glowing panels, and the seats were made of a material that felt like liquid silk. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Lyra slid into the seat beside him, her fingers dancing across a control panel. The door slid shut, and the vehicle hummed to life, the sound vibrating through Jake's bones. He gripped the edges of his seat, his knuckles turning white. Hold on, Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. Before Jake could respond, the vehicle shot forward, the force pinning him to his seat. The trees blurred past, and Jake felt his stomach lurch as they soared into the air. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to steady his breathing. What the hell is going on? Jake demanded, his voice shaking. Who or what is chasing us? And why the hell do you need my help? Lyra glanced at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. The creatures chasing us are called the Vorath, she said. They're a parasitic species that feeds on the energy of other beings. They've been hunting my people for centuries, and now they've set their sights on Earth. Jake's mind reeled. Why Earth? What do they want with us? Your planet is rich in resources, Lyra explained. Resources that the Vorath need to sustain themselves. If they succeed, they'll drain Earth of its energy, leaving it a barren wasteland. Jake felt a cold knot of fear settle in his stomach. And you think I can stop them? I'm just a mechanic, Lyra. I don't know the first thing about fighting aliens. Lyra's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked almost human. You're more than a mechanic, Jake. You have a gift, a connection to the energy of the universe. It's why I chose you. Jake stared at her, his mind racing. A gift? What are you talking about? Before Lyra could respond, the vehicle shuddered violently, throwing Jake against the door. He winced, his shoulder throbbing from the impact. What was that? Lyra's hands flew across the control panel, her eyes narrowing in concentration. The Vorath. They've found us. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What do we do? We fight, Lyra said, her voice steady. But we can't do it alone. We need to find the others. Others? Jake asked, his voice rising in panic. What others? There are more like you, Lyra explained. Humans with unique abilities. Together you might stand a chance against the Vorath. Jake shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. This is insane. I'm not some kind of superhero, Lyra. I can't fight aliens. Lyra turned to him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. You don't have a choice, Jake. If we don't stop the Vorath, your world, and everyone you care about, will be destroyed. Jake felt a surge of anger, his fear momentarily overshadowed by frustration. You don't get to just show up out of nowhere and drop this on me. I didn't ask for this. I know, Lyra said softly. And I'm sorry. But the universe doesn't care about what we want. It only cares about what we do. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips as the vehicle shuddered again, this time more violently. He glanced out the window and felt his blood run cold. The Vorath were closing in, dark, shadowy figures with glowing red eyes and jagged, claw-like appendages. They moved with a terrifying speed, their forms shifting and twisting as if they were made of smoke. We're not going to make it, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. We will, Lyra said, her voice firm. But we need to act fast. She reached into a compartment beneath the control panel and pulled out a small, cylindrical device. It was about the size of a flashlight, with a glowing blue tip. She handed it to Jake, her expression serious. What's this? Jake asked, turning the device over in his hands. A disruptor, Lyra explained. It emits a pulse of energy that can temporarily disable the Vorath. Use it to buy us some time. Jake stared at the device, his mind racing. How do I? Before he could finish, the vehicle lurched violently, throwing him against the door again. He winced, his shoulder throbbing, and glanced out the window. The Vorath were almost on them, their glowing eyes filled with a terrifying hunger. Now, Jake! Lyra shouted. Jake didn't hesitate. He pressed the button on the disruptor, and a pulse of blue energy erupted from the device, spreading out in a wave. The Vorath screeched, their forms flickering and distorting as the energy washed over them. For a moment it seemed to work, the creatures slowed, their movements becoming sluggish. But then, to Jake's horror, they began to recover, their forms solidifying once more. It's not enough, Jake said, his voice shaking. They're still coming. Lyra's jaw tightened, and she nodded. Then we'll have to try something else. She reached for the control panel again, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The vehicle's hum grew louder, and Jake felt a surge of energy as it accelerated, the trees below blurring into a sea of green. Where are we going? Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. To the others, Lyra said. We need to regroup and come up with a plan. But we'll have to move fast. The Vorath won't stay disabled for long. Jake nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear, his life would never be the same. And as the vehicle shot through the night sky, the Vorath hot on their trail, Jake couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for what was coming. The vehicle shot through the night sky, the hum of its engine a constant reminder of the danger closing in behind them. Jake gripped the edges of his seat, his knuckles white, as Lyra expertly navigated through the dense forest below. The Vorath were relentless, their shadowy forms flickering in and out of view as they pursued the fleeing craft. "How much farther?" Jake asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Not far," Lyra replied, her eyes focused on the controls. "We're almost there." Jake wanted to ask where there was, but the words caught in his throat as the vehicle shuddered violently. He glanced out the window and felt his stomach drop. The Vorath were gaining on them, their glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness. "They're right behind us!" Jake shouted. Lyra's jaw tightened, and she pushed the vehicle to its limits. The trees below blurred into a sea of green as they raced toward their destination. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. He still couldn't believe this was happening. Aliens, ancient enemies, and now, apparently, other humans with special abilities. It was like something out of a sci-fi movie, but there was no escaping the reality of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the vehicle began to slow. Jake peered out the window and saw a large, metallic structure nestled in a clearing. It looked like a cross between a spaceship and a fortress, with sleek, angular walls that shimmered in the moonlight. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our sanctuary," Lyra said, her voice tinged with relief. "It's a safe haven for those like us." The vehicle descended smoothly, landing with a soft thud on the ground. Lyra quickly powered down the engine and turned to Jake, her expression serious. "Stay close to me," she said. "And whatever you do, don't wander off." Jake nodded, his heart pounding as he followed Lyra out of the vehicle. The air was thick with tension, and he could feel the weight of the Vorath's presence pressing down on him. They were close, too close. As they approached the structure, a door slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. Lyra stepped inside, and Jake followed, his eyes darting around nervously. The walls were lined with glowing panels, and the air was filled with a faint hum of energy. "Where are the others?" Jake asked, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. "They're here," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. "But we need to move quickly. The Vorath won't wait." Jake nodded, his mind racing as they made their way deeper into the structure. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, they reached a large, circular room filled with strange, futuristic equipment. In the center of the room stood three people, 2 men and a woman, each with a unique, almost otherworldly presence. "Jake, meet the others," Lyra said, gesturing to the group. "This is Marcus, Elena, and Kian." Jake stared at them, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Marcus was tall and muscular, with a scar running down the side of his face. Elena was petite, with fiery red hair and piercing green eyes. Kian was lean and wiry, with a mischievous grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the team," Marcus said, his voice deep and commanding. "We've been expecting you." Jake blinked, his mind reeling. "Expecting me? What's going on here?" "We'll explain everything," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. "But first we need to prepare. The Vorath are coming, and we don't have much time." Jake wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the urgency in her voice left no room for debate. He nodded, his heart pounding as he followed the group to a large, circular table in the center of the room. The surface of the table was covered in holographic projections, displaying maps, schematics, and other data that Jake couldn't begin to understand. "The Vorath are drawn to energy," Lyra explained, her voice steady. "They'll stop at nothing to drain the sanctuary of its power. If they succeed, we'll lose our only safe haven." "So what's the plan?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "We fight," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We use our abilities to hold them off and buy ourselves some time." Jake shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Abilities? What abilities? I don't even know what I'm doing here." Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly warm. "You have a gift, Jake. A connection to the energy of the universe. You just need to learn how to use it." Jake stared at her, his mind racing. How? I don't even know where to start. We'll help you, Elena said, her voice calm but firm. But we need to move quickly. The Vorath are almost here. Jake nodded, his heart pounding as he followed the group to a large, circular platform in the center of the room. The surface of the platform was covered in glowing symbols, and the air was thick with energy. Stand here, Kian said, gesturing to the center of the platform. And focus. Let the energy flow through you. Jake stepped onto the platform, his legs trembling. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, and he could feel it pulsing through his veins. Focus, Jake, Lyra said, her voice soft but firm. Feel the energy. Let it guide you. Jake took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. He could feel the energy around him, swirling and shifting like a living thing. It was overwhelming, but he forced himself to focus, to let it flow through him. And then, something clicked. Jake's eyes snapped open, and he felt a surge of power coursing through him. The symbols on the platform glowed brighter, and the air around him seemed to shimmer with energy. He could feel it, the connection Lyra had spoken of. It was like a switch had been flipped, and suddenly, he understood. I can feel it, Jake said, his voice filled with awe. I can feel the energy. Good, Marcus said, his voice firm. Now let's see what you can do. Before Jake could respond, the room shook violently, throwing him off balance. He stumbled, his heart pounding as the sound of screeching filled the air. The Vorath had arrived. They're here! Elena shouted, her voice tinged with panic. Get ready! Marcus commanded, his voice steady. We hold them off as long as we can. Jake nodded, his mind racing as he followed the group to the entrance of the sanctuary. The Vorath were already there, their shadowy forms flickering in and out of view. Their glowing red eyes were filled with a terrifying hunger, and Jake could feel their presence pressing down on him. Stay close, Lyra said, her voice firm. And remember, we're stronger together. Jake nodded, his heart pounding as the Vorath surged forward. The battle was chaos, a blur of energy, light, and shadow. Jake fought with everything he had, his newfound abilities giving him an edge he hadn't expected. But the Vorath were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. As the battle raged on, Jake began to realize the true extent of the danger they were in. The Vorath were more than just a threat, they were a force of nature, a relentless wave of destruction that would stop at nothing to achieve their goal. And Jake knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning.